intermittent fasting. Culturally, there are so many festivals and cultures in India that suggest for us to fast. Do you think that maybe the history of it also comes from religion?
Gandhi, right? He fasted. Some of the famous Greek philosophers would fast, and they've written that they did their best thinking when they're fasting.
When we start to grow, we are told we need energy to grow. As you start to make money, you should eat well. Now what you're saying is counterintuitive. I should eat less.
Animals, including our human ancestors, evolved in environments where food was scarce. So over generations and generations, our brain, our bodies have evolved. They function well under conditions of limited food availability. Men and women between the ages of 55 and 70 with obesity, they are much more likely to develop dementia. Intermittent fasting is good for the brain, the heart, and muscles. Challenge, recover, repeat.
Hello everyone, this is Vikas and you are on another episode of Run with Fitpage. Today, we are discussing an important topic, which we have not covered in over 200 episodes of ours that we have produced so far. Today, we are discussing about brain aging. We are discussing about the role of intermittent fasting and how that helps improve various conditions, including brain aging. We have the pleasure of speaking with someone who's expert at it, and you will see from the introduction very soon. I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Mark Mattson. Dr. Mattson is leading research on how lifestyle and lifestyle-led choices impact brain function, how intermittent fasting impacts brain function, and what all can we do if we want to get onto intermittent fasting. In the conversation today, we discuss intermittent fasting from health as well as from performance point of view. Let's take a pen and paper and get ready to go through this masterclass on intermittent fasting with Dr. Mark Mattson. Let's go. Dr. Mattson, welcome to the show. It's our weekly conversation where we get to speak with eminent speakers as that of yours. And today, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
It's great to join you because I've been a runner for, a long time.
It might be a little lesser known to people about your running journey. How about we start from there itself? When did you start running? Were you running recreationally, out of passion, or professionally? How was it for you?
Not professionally, no. Pretty competitive in local or state events. But so in high school, I didn't run cross country or track in high school, and it was mainly because in the spring and fall I was racing motocross, dirt bikes, and then also I grew up on a farm, and my father and grandfather trained and raced what are called harness horses, trotters and pacers that pull a cart. So we had a training track. But I wrestled. I was a wrestler during the winter. I was from Minnesota, so it's a lot of snow in the winter, right? And there was several cross-country runners on the wrestling team, and the coach would have us, just to see how good a shape we were in towards the beginning of the season, would have us run a mile for time. And I ran faster than the cross-country team runners, so I thought, I'm not too bad a runner. But then I didn't start running in earnest till college, and then I started running every day. Yeah, so it depends where we lived. For example, I was a professor at University of Kentucky for 11 years. We lived 3 miles from from the laboratory where I had a lab. And so I'd run in and back every day, and that was my, 6 miles a day. And then on the weekends, I'd do some longer runs, and I'd run in mainly 10K races. Back then, the most popular races were 10K. And now it's 5K because you get more people. More people are willing to run 5K than 10K. But then when I moved to Baltimore and I was a lab chief at the National Institute on Aging, lived 25 miles from the lab, so I didn't run in and back every day. But I got into trail running, so I would get into the lab early, and then I'd leave a little early. I was the boss, so I could do that. And there's some nice trails on the way home, along river, and then some hills going up away from the river with trails. And so I started to really like trail running. And so I I did that last part of, when I was running fairly competitively. Half marathon was probably the longest distance I'd do. That was more typical half marathon and 10K trail races.
Do you now race in any of the other races other than half? Do you also race in marathon or something?
Right now, I'm just mainly doing stationary bike, walking some, and doing something I never did before, and I should have, and some mild resistance training and so on. So anyway, that's my story now.
But you're staying pretty fit. You look pretty fit, so it seems the other.
Yeah, I'm pretty fit. I do just 30 minutes on the stationary bike. I get my heart rate up, and then do some other light things. And I have a good cardiovascular system,
Right.
from all that running. Yeah.
Indeed. So that brings to the other parallel and possibly connected as well is your interest in neuroscience, because a part of that we'll be discussing today. How did your interest grow in neuroscience, and were you academically interested in researching about the brain and various other experiments, or did it grow over a period of time?
Over a period of time, I planned on being a veterinarian. I mentioned I used to train and race horses.
Yeah.
Right. But I didn't get into veterinary medicine school. It's actually it's more competitive than medical school, because there aren't very many veterinary medicine schools. And then I decided to go on to graduate school. Of course, I took all these science courses, and I was interested in neuroendocrinology, and specifically, the relationship between the brain and glands, particularly the adrenal glands, kind of that stress gland. That's the gland where cells produce adrenaline, epinephrine,
Yeah,
and also cortisol, and it's controlled by the brain and stress responses. And so I did a master's and PhD degree studying essentially stress response of the neuroendocrine system. And then my postdoc research in Colorado, which, by the way, that was a good place to run and ride bike, because there's
of course,
mountains, and they'd have a race called the Boulder in Boulder, Colorado, every year. It's 10K, but it's really hilly, and they get elite runners so this tells you how old I am. Frank Shorter.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was running race, and a guy from Mexico called Arturo Barrios. And so they were, I'd run typically around 35 minutes, which isn't very fast for men. Although on hilly, it's not bad. So as I got older, my goal was to beat the first woman runner.
Okay.
Because that's about where I was when I got in my 40s and so on. And but in Colorado, I was studying. It was a little bit different. I was studying nerve cells in culture, and this lab I was in, we discovered, and I discovered that neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals released from one neuron that excite or inhibit another neuron, so they're released at a synapse, these connections between the neurons. And I discovered that glutamate, which is the most important neurotransmitter in the brain that most people haven't heard of.
Yeah.
Most people have heard of dopamine or serotonin, but 90% of the neurons in the brain use glutamate as their neurotransmitter. It's an amino acid, actually. So it's a building block of protein, but it's also a signal between neurons. So 90% of the neurons in your brain communicate with glutamate. And then these other neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, for example, the only way they affect our behavior, whether it's mood or learning and memory or moving, sensing thing, is the only way these other neurotransmitters do that is by affecting the ongoing activity in the neurons that use glutamate. So these other neurotransmitters are kind of neuromodulatory. So I discovered that glutamate plays an important role in the wiring of the brain during development. So it's a critical role in the formation of synapses during development. But it turns out, so I mentioned that it stimulates, it excites neurons, it causes them to fire, glutamate does. So I discovered, and this was a new finding back then, in the early 80s, that glutamate can excite neurons to death. So if I found if I add high level of glutamate to these cultured brain nerve cells, they die. And now this process is called excitotoxicity, and it's a major player in most brain disorders, severe epileptic seizures, where it's obvious you get these overexcitation of the neurons out of control. That involves glutamate. But also in stroke, when you have reduced oxygen, glucose, or ketones, which we'll talk about when we get to intermittent fasting, the neurons, they actually die by excitotoxicity because they're still being stimulated when they aren't getting enough energy to support their activity. But then, so that's what got me interested in brain aging, because, okay, well, this new way that neurons are dying, excitotoxicity, the neurons we were studying were from a brain region called the hippocampus, which is very critical for learning and memory. And it's also, the neurons in the hippocampus die in Alzheimer's disease, in severe epileptic seizures, in stroke. So they're very vulnerable to dying in these disorders. So that got me interested in aging. And we pursued this excitotoxicity idea for the next 30 years, up until I retired a few years ago. Okay, but then it became clear to me that there's not going to be any drug that reverses Alzheimer's disease, reverses Parkinson's disease, completely restores function after a stroke. So more than 20 years ago, about close to 30 years ago, I was already, my idea was, what are the risk factors for these disorders? Can we some way stimulate or otherwise affect through our environment and our lifestyle the vulnerability of the neurons to aging and age-related disease? And this is how I got into intermittent fasting, because it was known, it had just been shown definitively that caloric restriction or daily time-restricted eating will extend the lifespan of mice or rats. And a colleague of mine, who actually I became his boss when I took a lab chief position at the National Institutes of Health, he had shown, and at this time I was at the University of Kentucky, he had shown that every other day fasting, every other day food deprivation, if you start that when rats or mice are young adults and continue that throughout their life, they live up to twice as long as the mice or rats that have food every day and food available all the time. So that's a dramatic effect. And so what I did is I very quickly recruited 3 different postdoctoral scientists that had expertise in rat or mouse models that are relevant to Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and stroke. And so we simply took the rats or mice, we divide them into 2 groups. One group gets intermittent fasting, the other group, no intermittent fasting. And then we had them on those 2 different eating regimens, eating patterns, if you will, for several months. And then back then, our model of Alzheimer's was actually using an excitotoxin that selectively damages the hippocampal neurons. And it causes amnesia or learning and memory impairment. So once you administer this toxin and the neurons die, the animals perform very poorly in learning and memory tests. They can't remember anything that you teach them. So we found that the animals on the intermittent fasting, the neurons in the hippocampus were resistant to degeneration, resistant to this excitotoxin, and their memory ability was preserved. That was a very profound effect. And then similarly in the Parkinson's disease model and the stroke model, we physically shut off the blood supply to one artery in the brain, and the neurons that receive blood from that artery will degenerate. But there's this region, the neurons where it's pretty much completely shut off, they die. There's no way that we can protect them, we don't think. But there's this bigger region actually surrounding that where the neurons are kind of some die, some not. And we found that the intermittent fasting protected those neurons and prevented a lot of the physical impairment caused by the stroke. Okay, so then, right, so this was really important, and this was before anyone was really doing studies in earnest with intermittent fasting, trying to understand how it might improve health in the long run. And so we started looking at what's happening in cells and organ systems. We focused a lot on the brain, but also the cardiovascular system and a little bit on muscles. Actually, we found, at least in mice, intermittent fasting can enhance the ability of endurance training, running on a treadmill, enhance the efficacy of the training. And I can talk about that maybe in a little bit. But we found that the intermittent fasting was good for the brain, the heart, and muscles, and what's happening is very interesting. During the fasting period, it imposes a stress on the cells, very much similar to what happens in your muscle cells when you're exercising. Okay, it's a stress. It's actually a big stress on your muscle cells and your cardiovascular system. But it's a good stress as long as you have a recovery period. And we discovered and have written about, and I'm working on a third book. So I've written 2 books after I retired. One, The Intermittent Fasting Revolution, on the science of intermittent fasting. The second is called Sculptor and Destroyer.
Destroyer.
And it's all about glutamate. Because, I discovered it sculpts the brain during development. And we think actually with things like engaging in intellectual challenge or social interactions, there's some actual structural changes going on in neural networks. We call this neuroplasticity and glutamate. And my third book, which I'm about 2/3 of the way through, 3/4 of the way through, it's called Challenge, Recover, Repeat. And it's focused on the brain a lot, but it's all about what's happening in cells and organ systems during the challenge, whether it be exercise, fasting, or intellectual challenges, and then what's happening during the recovery period, eating, resting, sleeping. And it's pretty clear these cycles of stress, mild, good stress, physiological stress that we evolved with, and then recovery, optimize health of all our organ systems. And maybe we can talk a lot about what's actually going on during the challenge and recovery periods that explains this.
Indeed. Yeah, I was making mental notes as you were talking through your experience professionally, as well as your interest in endurance sport. And I have a number of questions. So I'm going to go through one by one because I'm also one of those people who had not heard much about glutamate. And it's a discovery during when I was researching about you, is that I found out about it, and it was so phenomenal to read of it. You talked about how one thing led to another, and that led to brain aging, that led to intermittent fasting. And when we think as laymen, we think of these keywords as intermittent fasting, whether it's good for us or not good for us. We'll possibly talk about all of these. But before we even get to any of these, I wanted to get some of the basics right for our understanding. One is, when we start to grow, we are told we need energy to grow, and we need energy in the right proportion as we are growing. When I was growing up, I grew up in a farmer's family. We were not most privileged, and at times we'll eat less. Most of the times we'll eat less. And we were pretty lean, but very agile and pretty fast. As we became a little wealthier, we started to become fatter, a lot more fat than where we were. We are fit, but still not as agile as we used to be. And then one school of thought that was told in the society that as you start to make money, you should eat well, meaning you should eat a lot as well. That's how it is in India. That, hey, you should be able to afford going out. You should be able to afford eating better, etc. Now what you're saying is counterintuitive. Like when I think from that school of thought, that is, I should eat less. And the point is, can we start from the very start as to what is happening? Why is energy required? And if that is required in the right proportion, why are we saying that we should not be eating as much? Because that's what we are consuming anyway, isn't it?
Well, yeah. So we need energy to survive, right? And if you think about this, the way I think about this is from evolution standpoint, evolutionary principles. So
Yeah.
Animals, including our human ancestors, evolved in environments where food was scarce, and there was a lot of competition for limited energy, limited food resources. And the easiest way to look at this maybe is from the standpoint of a predator, where they're in an environment where the prey animals are not really abundant, and they have to work physically, expend a lot of physical effort to acquire food. Actually, it doesn't matter whether you're foraging or, you're a predator hunting down a prey animal, whether it's so human hunter-gatherers, for example, generally they forage and hunt. So that's the typical environment. And if you look, there's only a couple hunter-gatherer societies still around in the world. But if you just look at those individuals, they all look like Kenyan runners.
Yeah.
So their brains and their bodies had to be able to function very well in a food-deprived state. Therefore, individuals whose brains and bodies did function better than other individuals had a survival advantage. They were able to acquire the energy, the food, and survive, and pass those genes on. So over generations and generations, our brain, our bodies have evolved to not only function well under conditions of limited food availability, but to take advantage of the processes that make them function better. So the point there is, in my view, is our brains and bodies don't function optimally unless we activate, engage those systems, those cell signaling systems and so on that evolved so that we do function well. And that's exactly what we're discovering with our intermittent fasting. So most of the work we've been done is in mice and rats, but I've been involved in quite a few human clinical trials of intermittent fasting. The first one was a small one in asthma patients, where we found that it was every other day time-restricted eating over a period of 2 months improved symptoms in asthma patients and reduced inflammation in their airways. And then we did a big study with a group in England, Michelle Harvey, what we now call 5-2 intermittent fasting. We didn't call it that in the study. We had 100 women, and we assigned them either to 2 days a week, eating only about 500 calories each day. I guess I need to define what intermittent fasting is because it will help going forward. So
that's right.
Let's say a typical American eats breakfast, lunch, dinner, and evening snack, and doesn't exercise a lot, just normal daily activities. Okay, every time they eat, the energy goes into their liver, and it's stored as glucose.
Yeah.
Okay. If they overeat, that is, if they take in more calories than they expend in energy through physical or mental or just basal metabolism, then they gain weight. And that weight is mainly fat. It's pretty much all fat. Okay, breakfast, lunch, dinner. So every time they eat, these glucose stores in the liver are replenished, and fat is never used as an energy source. Okay, so
this is the stored fat of the body.
Yeah, the fat accumulates, and that.
Got it.
And from an evolutionary perspective, that's probably good because you're running on fat. You're literally using fat once you've depleted the liver glucose. Although actually you can break down protein and use it, but that's when you get towards starvation. Intermittent fasting eating patterns are eating patterns where you deplete completely the liver glucose stores and you switch to using fats and the ketones, which are molecules derived from the fats in your fat cells. Okay, so there's this metabolic switch that occurs usually about 12 hours after the onset of fasting. If you exercise during that fasting period, for example, towards the end, then it will enhance the use of fats and ketones. So actually, personally, what I've done for about 40 years, don't eat breakfast, and then I exercise in the late morning. Actually, I'm doing that now. I did that for the most part until I started trail running. But I'll tell you another story. It's anecdotal about the trail running. Okay, so anyway, so that's intermittent fasting. So with the 5-2 intermittent fasting, the study I mentioned with the group in England, the women on the 5-2 intermittent fasting on those 2 days where they're only eating 500 calories, that's way less than you need to keep glucose stores in your liver. And they're switching to using fats. Then the control group, the second group of 50 women, we had them eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but each meal had about 25% fewer calories than they would normally eat. And we calculated the weekly calorie intake of both groups should be about the same. If you do the calculation. So we're controlling for overall calorie intake, and we're comparing essentially calorie restriction, but eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and not having the metabolic switching occurring. We're comparing that to 2 days a week burning fat. It was a 6-month study. Both groups of women lost the same amount of body weight, about 8% of their initial weight. That makes sense because their calorie intake was the same. But the women on the intermittent fasting had a greater improvement, highly significant statistically, in insulin sensitivity, which is a measure of the ability of cells, when glucose is available, to take it up and then store it or use it. Actually, muscle has some glycogen, some glucose stores it can use. Right, so that study then led to the popularization of intermittent fasting on the internet. that study. And the reason is there was a producer at the BBC who was a medical doctor. He saw this paper published because it was in England. And so he did a documentary. Actually, the documentary had a famous, I think he was Indian marathon runner in it, like the first part of it. Anyway, the documentary, which came out in 2013, is called Eat Fast, Live Longer. And so they came to my laboratory and a couple other laboratories, and then that aired on the BBC. And then it started to get a lot of chatter on the internet. And then it just like took off from there.
I think Michael Mosley was he was born in Calcutta. He was born in India.
And he passed away, because he got heat stroke, apparently. He was on a Greek island. This was just this past year, I think. He was on a Greek island. It was like 40-some centigrade, over 100 Fahrenheit, like 40 degrees, whatever, it doesn't matter. And
you're talking about Fauja Singh, I guess, as the Indian runner. Yeah, that's Fauja Singh. He was known as the oldest marathon runner. That's right.
Yeah. And,
he's a Sikh runner, legendary Sikh runner, a British Indian.
Yeah. That's cool. And so we were in the same documentary. Look at that.
Yeah.
So I was at the National Institutes of Health, right? The main medical research funding place in the world. I was doing my research. We were involved in some clinical trials, other ones in addition to what I mentioned. And so I'd keep talking to the administration higher up in the NIH about this. They got pretty convinced that this is very important. And they requested applications for grant proposals for clinicians to do clinical trials of intermittent fasting. There are over 300 clinical trials of intermittent fasting, controlled clinical trials in humans comparing intermittent fasting to usually 3 meals a day in normal healthy people, in people with obesity. It's very clear if you can stick to intermittent fasting eating pattern, you can lose weight. Diabetes, it's very effective, type 2 diabetes. Many trials in cancer now, because we think the cancer cells are more easily killed by chemotherapy and radiation when the individual is fasting, because the cancer cells are deprived of glucose, which is their main energy source, are relatively deprived. Neurological disorders, we did a study that came out last year in a journal called Cell Metabolism, it's actually a good journal. There's a very well-known journal called Cell, which is one of the most highly cited, and they kind of expanded. They have cell metabolism, and this is looking at the brain. The first only study so far where someone has looked at the effects of intermittent fasting on the brain. So we had men and women between the ages of 55 and 70, and with obesity, so body mass index over 30, and they had insulin resistance, which is kind of a precursor to prediabetes, it's called. The reason we chose that group is they are much more likely to develop dementia and Alzheimer's than are people without obesity and insulin resistance. And then we randomly assigned them to 5-2 intermittent fasting or a healthy living diet, which is somewhat calorie restricted, but eating 3 meals. And then before we started them on the interventions, and 2 months later, and this was done by Dimitrios Kapagiannis. Yeah, actually, he's from Greece originally. He was a neurologist under me, and then he's still at NIA doing clinical trials. And so he did psychological tests, a lot of learning and memory tests, MRI, so brain imaging,
Yeah.
and then blood work, and also he did spinal taps to get the fluid that bathes the brain. And the bottom line is, we found that the group on intermittent fasting had significant improvements in this memory, trying to recall how many words you've read in a list. Wait 30 minutes and then try to recall as many. They're better at task switching, so switching your attention, being able to concentrate on one thing and then quickly switch and concentrate on another, and some other aspects of cognition that involve the prefrontal cortex. And interestingly, the group with healthy living diet with small reduction in calorie intake, they didn't improve in learning and memory. And then we found some other interesting things. Yeah. So I know you're getting the more I talk, the more questions you get. But
yeah, I keep thinking that my questions are going to go on for hours, I guess, because it's so interesting to go through these.
You're probably more busy than me because I'm retired, but I could go on for.
Not at all. Let me take a couple of these questions so that it will be understood by our listeners very clearly. So it's clear that intermittent fasting does help in multiple ways, and also very interestingly, culturally, there are so many festivals and cultures in India that suggest for us to fast. And I'm thinking there could be possibly a scientific relevance to it as well. Like, for example, my mother has been fasting twice a year for 9 days in a stretch, and she only eats and it's a religious, so she will fast because she's worshiping a goddess. And similarly, there are so many other occasions when people fast here in India. Do you think from your study that it actually, maybe the stemming of it, the history of it also comes from religion where it was already being practiced?
So there's so many things that you don't have to be a scientist to discover things just by trial and error. And there's Gandhi, right? He fasts. And
Yeah.
I think that not only him, there's some of the famous Greek philosophers would fast, and they've written that they did their best thinking when they're fasting.
While fasting.
And I find I do my best thinking like right now. So it's morning here. It's 9:22 in the morning where I'm living. I haven't eaten since 6 p.m. last night. And right now my brain's functioning really well. If we would have done this interview after I eat lunch, I don't know if you'd be able to notice it, but I won't be quite as sharp. So I've done, for 40 years, I've done all my critical thinking and writing in the morning when I'm in a fasted
While
state.
fasted.
And then the rest of the day after I eat, I do things that don't take as much concentration, things that you can, more routine things. And I found that I'm really productive that way. So getting back to the religion, yeah, I think that people just discovered they feel better. And, in the religious texts, the people that wrote those texts, I don't know, they fasted themselves, right? And so essentially they're passing their personal experience on. Fasting as part of religion, I think, is a good thing. If you think it'll help you get to heaven, that's good. Or if it helps you get closer to God, I guess that's good. Although I'm very skeptical.
Right.
I like to see evidence.
Right.
It's kind of important.
Yeah, I think from a health perspective is what we are discussing. So we stay with that and not get into what happens post life, because I totally get it. I'm also not very sure what happens because we are not aware of it.
What I can say is for sure is
Yeah,
all your nerve cells are dead.
right.
So you won't be able to imagine or think or experience anything.
Anything. Yeah.
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 Okay.
Indeed. So can we take it to 3 points? One, what is the right protocol of fasting, just to start with at a very general level? Meaning, you said one of the things is at the onset of, possibly at the end of 12 hours or so from the onset of fasting, you start to see the body is using fat. Is it the case in all the situations, meaning whether you're working out, whether you're sleeping, whether you're working or anything else? So is that the general rule that at least you should be fasting for 12 hours?
Yeah, the 12 hours is related just to your normal activity. During sleep, it's less energy used because you're not moving, although your brain's still using energy. And during exercise, you're using more energy. So the metabolic switch, the switch to using fats and ketones. So ketones are molecules that levels go up in the blood during fasting after this metabolic switch. They're an energy source for neurons. They can be used to produce ATP, the energy currency. But we found they also, and others are finding, the ketones also act as a hormone. They're actually a stress hormone in a way, and they act to make cells. So what happens is the ketones turn on genes that protect the cells against stress. Oxidative stress, free radicals, metabolic stress, something we called proteotoxic stress, accumulation of aggregated proteins like amyloid, or there's one called tau in Alzheimer's or other things, and also stimulate autophagy, which is a way cells clear out the garbage and recycle. So that happens during the fasting period, after the metabolic switch. It can be enhanced by exercising during the fasting period. And then during the recovery period, which is also critical, cells go into a growth and plasticity mode. So your muscle cells, for example, during physical exercise, they do not get bigger while you're exercising. They don't get bigger, stronger, better endurance during the exercise. It's during the recovery period is when they're growing. But they won't grow and have more mitochondria and be able to generate more ATP unless you exercise. So you have to have the stress, with whether it's fasting or exercise, that sets in motion the events that during the recovery period make your cells stronger, more resilient, more stress resistant, better endurance.
Got it.
Now, also from running standpoint, there's a scientist does a lot of human studies in Italy, Antonio Paoli, who's done multiple studies looking at endurance athletes' effects of intermittent fasting on their performance. And this is either cyclists or runners. And what he's finding is that there can be an enhancement of performance with intermittent fasting. I mentioned I do trail running, and I usually do it in like late afternoon. And I would take my lunch with me to work at the lab and eat in my office, right? Don't waste time. And so sometimes I forgot to bring my lunch. And so, and then I'd go running at 3 p.m, like hour and a half trail run. And I found actually I was running better if I didn't eat anything at all before the run. And then I got thinking about this phenomenon that a long time ago we called it second wind, right?
Yeah.
Second wind. I'd usually get this about 40 minutes into a run. It'd start to get easier. And what I think is happening, if you go into the run and you still have glucose in your liver, at some point that's depleted, and then there's this short period where maybe your performance goes down a little. And then when the ketones start going up, your performance increases. So I think it's very important for a lot of work to be done in this area as far as endurance athletes I tried to get the coach for the Johns Hopkins College cross-country team to do an experiment with me, but he didn't want to take a chance that the intermittent. What I wanted him to do is during the training leading up to the competitive season, just have him take half of his runners and put them on intermittent fasting, the other half not, but otherwise they eat as many calories, eat whatever they want, and then compare their performance. They run on the same exact, or at least some of the same exact courses every year, same distance, same course. Compare their performance, compare the improvement or not in their performance from the previous year, and then compare the two groups. But he didn't want to take a chance that the intermittent fasting would do it. So I think there needs to be work, but for sure the intermittent fasting is going to improve your cardiovascular health. We found that it will reduce blood pressure, reduce resting heart rate, very similar to what you get with endurance training. We think by a very similar mechanism, enhancing the parasympathetic control of the heart. Inflammation, a big effect in suppressing inflammation, which is associated with most age-related chronic
most of the issues.
disorders. And then mental health. As you know, exercise is the best antidepressant.
Indeed.
And I found that too. When I had these injuries and couldn't exercise, my mood went down really bad. And then when I got back to exercising, so everybody knows that. Intermittent fasting, the same thing. I think people will find their mood is improved. One very important word of advice. If you want to switch your eating pattern to intermittent fasting, whether it's a daily time restricted eating like I do, eating all your food within a 6 to 8 hour time window, which I think is the easiest for people to do, it takes at least 2 weeks, maybe a month, for you to adapt so that you're no longer hungry during the time period you'd previously been eating. And also it takes time for your systems to adapt. It's like exercise. If you've been sedentary and you start exercise, it takes you a month at least to get in shape so that you start to feel really good all the time. And then if you don't exercise, you feel bad. So I think that's a very important practical thing, because I've had many people come to me and say, I tried intermittent fasting, I tried not eating breakfast or whatever. I can't do it. I'm hungry and irritable, can't concentrate. And I'd say, how long did you keep that? And say, well, I just did it once.
Not good enough to form a habit, for sure. Now, if we, what we can do is we can come to a couple of protocols in a bit. But before that, primarily from endurance sports perspective, which is our listeners' base mostly, we are told that fat is not the most efficient source of energy when you are working out, or particularly when you are running fast for that matter. So how would in this case that not be the case? Will it impact my performance?
Whoa. You won't use fat if your liver has glucose in it, or certainly if you're taking during an event taking in glucose. No, you're not going to use any fat. You're only using the glucose. The idea I'm suggesting, and people can just try it. Get adapted somewhat to intermittent fasting, and then start your running or your event, if you're going on an hour run, start it in the fasted state when you've already started to use the fats. It turns out ketones are actually, from the standpoint of cells, are more efficient than glucose. For every molecule of a ketone, a cell will produce more ATP than for each molecule of glucose.
Right. And they are available in abundance?
And they're also fewer free radicals are produced. So when you take in glucose, more free radicals are produced in the cells. It's very clear from the standpoint, so there's kind of two things here. There's the performance aspect, and then there's the long-term health aspect.
That's right.
Right? And they're not necessarily the same.
Yeah.
It's very clear that intermittent fasting for long-term health is good.
Yeah.
And that overeating is bad.
Yeah.
For endurance performance, more work needs to be done. There are published studies suggesting a potential benefit. For sprints or resistance, there's been many studies showing that intermittent fasting does not have any negative effect on resistance training, the ability to increase muscle mass, as long as you're taking in the same amount each day or week, energy, protein, and so on. That makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So I think more needs to be done from the endurance standpoint, but it's something very important to consider. And, people are hesitant to change things.
Yeah.
Right. And this is something that you've got over a period of months, just try it out and maybe keep a little logbook with your times and
see how it changes.
Psychological aspect, because you're intermittent fasting. So, if you start a run, I don't know, there's potential confounds here. Last thing, I'm sure you've heard of people taking ketone esters too.
Yes.
Okay, that was a colleague of mine at the NIH, Richard Veach. He was the first one to make the ketone ester. And then he gave some of it to my lab, and we found it had beneficial effects in a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease. And then he also gave it to an exercise physiologist at Oxford University, Karen Clark, and she found that it improved performance in elite British cyclists. And actually, they knew that before, like 7 years before anyone else knew about it. And there were 3 years there where a British cyclist won the Tour de France. Before that, no British cyclist had ever won the Tour de France. It was during a 5-year period. 2 British cyclists won the Tour de France. One won it 2 years. Another one won it years. They were taking the ketone ester. Then now probably, I don't know this, I'm just guessing, probably all of these athletes are taking the ketone ester. So this is the same ketone that goes up during fasting. And it's right. And
I have a question just here on ketone. How much of, like, for example, at any stage, we know that up to certain calories we can have these formed from glucose, for example. In terms of ketone, how much of that will go up, and will that be available in abundance if I was fat adapted and then I was not using glucose during my training or before that, for example?
Yeah, so it comes from fat. So you have to have some fat stores to get ketone.
Yeah, of course.
If you have zero, you won't. So you have to replenish those fat stores during the recovery period. when you eat and sleep and rest, the fat stores are refilled. And right, so people can live for a month without taking any calories. And most people have enough fat stores for a month. Then you get beyond a month, for example, elite distance runners, they may start to break down muscle a lot if they go a month, and it'd be starvation. Right, so the key thing is replenishing the fat stores during the recovery period. Then you always have plenty of ketones just for a marathon, which is pretty trivial as far as fat. There's no way you're going to deplete your fat stores in just a marathon.
Sure. And if we think from a health perspective, and if we were to suggest a protocol for people, what would be the right way for them to start? For example, listening to this conversation today, I decide that it seems like intermittent fasting is a great thing, which it is from the conversation that is coming out. How do I take my next steps to start planning? That is the first question. The second part of the question is, are there certain tests that I should do in advance to just see how it improves over a period of time, for example?
That's a good question. So the first question, I recommend daily time restricted eating. You can figure out based on your family and work schedule and stuff. Compress the time window you eat to 6 to 8 hours.
Okay. So all meals within 6 to 8 hours.
Yeah. I myself, I'll eat a lunch, then I'll eat something mid-afternoon, usually, like I actually eat whole grains, so whole grain bagel with olive oil or an apple, and then dinner. Most of my diet composition is plant-based, but I have my fish and milk as protein. So if you're a healthy weight and fit already, just make sure during that 6 to 8 hours you get the same amount of calories and diet composition as normally would. I think people will find that's not hard to do once they get used to it. And then it takes several weeks to a month to adapt. As far as what to measure, resting heart rate is good. Blood pressure is good. You won't see anything for several weeks. By a month, it's not going to be dramatic, but it will be measurable. If you have access to a doctor or someone who can do blood work, fasting glucose, fasting insulin, and then this hemoglobin, A1C.
Yeah, HbA1c.
Yeah. And then there's this kind of a general marker of inflammation. It's called C-reactive protein.
Yeah, CRP.
CRP. So I think those are the main things. And then, try. I think my schedule is good. If you like to exercise in the evening, then you can eat breakfast, lunch or whatever, kind of compress it earlier in the day. But I don't like that because I think it's not good to, then you won't be exercising in a fasted state, I guess is what I'm saying. But you can try that too. Skipping breakfast from a social standpoint and just ease of lifestyle seems the easiest because usually lunch and dinner are more eating with coworkers or family, and skipping breakfast is easier. So just get up and get to work.
Got it.
Yeah.
And during this 16 to 18 hours, when I should not be eating anything, does it mean not consume anything at all that has any caloric value?
Yes, that's right. Just water.
And how about caffeine?
Caffeine's okay. Caffeine
without milk, of course.
Yeah, you can have coffee or
no
tea.
coffee. Okay.
That's a whole nother story, but it turns out these chemicals like caffeine, the reason they're in the plant is to keep insects and other organisms from eating them. So they're like natural pesticides. And since we evolved consuming them, our cells respond in good ways to these. They induce a stress response. So caffeine actually induces mild stress on your brain cells. And it's a good stress as long as you don't overdo it.
Yeah. And when we say caffeine and coffee, we are talking about non-dairy based drink, correct?
Yeah.
Because milk will have calories, for example.
Yeah. Now, some people are putting medium chain triglycerides, MCT oil.
MCT oil, yeah.
In theory, that should be okay because it's fat, and what will cause ketone levels to drop quickly is if you take in any carbs. So definitely avoid carbs, and I think it's better just don't eat anything. And just stay hydrated. Tea or coffee are fine.
And electrolytes are fine too.
Yeah.
Got it. And from training point of view, I think you did explain, but I just wanted to understand better. We are saying training while fasted, and maybe the fasting duration should be at least minimum of 12 hours. Is the right time to work out?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you stop eating at 6 or 7 p.m. and then get up and go for a run at 6 or 7 a.m., that, and there was a time period. Well, I used to do that in Kentucky. I'd get up early and just run, and that's good too. But then don't eat anything till lunchtime, though.
Yeah, but I tend to feel very hungry after training, and also the theory that you should have a protein shake or something after workout is another.
No, that's fine. That's a good thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there's these certain signaling pathways. This mTOR pathway that's stimulated by the amino acids in the protein, and that's for the growth phase, the recovery phase. That's important.
Got it.
That's why I do what I do. I don't eat, then I exercise. I don't eat in the morning at all. Then I exercise around 11 a.m. For an hour, and then I eat right after that, and then I eat. So that's the recovery phase. You're getting the amino acids and other things into the muscle, heart, neurons that help them grow and optimize their function.
Got it. And I understood from for inflammation, you mentioned that possibly CRP test and maybe troponin could also help to figure out
that's
inflammation.
So troponin is usually used to see if people might have heart damage or heart attack, but I guess during if you over-exercise, well, it's heart specific. That's a whole nother story, Vikas. But there are other markers of inflammation. One is called TNF, tumor necrosis factor. Another is called interleukin-1 beta. Those are the two. There's a lot of drugs now, actually antibodies to TNF. I don't want to give the trade names of these, but people with arthritis are now widely prescribed these antibodies to TNF to suppress the inflammation. Actually, that's not good. As you know, if we get injured or even exercise, overexert yourself, you get some inflammation. But that short-term inflammation is actually good. It helps with the healing process. So exercise has anti-inflammatory effects in the long run. Intermittent fasting prevents chronic inflammation. So TNF and interleukin-1 beta can be measured, but most doctors
Mm-hmm.
normally do that.
Got it. Got it. Now I have two other questions, not really related, but very important. One of the points you mentioned, the good stress. Now, this is one question that keeps coming from almost all the listeners, that I'm stressed, or I'm managing my stress, or I worked out so that I get less stressed. Who better than you to explain to our viewers and listeners, that is, what is the stress and what's the difference between good stress and not good stress, for example?
Yeah. Stress is normally thought of as a bad thing. So bad stress is chronic psychosocial stress, psychological stress, or stress coming from chronic sleep deprivation, that kind of thing, where you're in a constant state of stress with no or little recovery period. So good stress is transient, controlled stress. So you're in control, exercise, fasting, intellectual challenges. So that's kind of the key difference. So bad stress in general, bad stress leads to chronic activation of the adrenal glands.
Yeah.
Okay. Whereas good stress, it's only transient. So during exercise, the adrenal glands are pouring out adrenaline, cortisol, but then when you stop exercising, it goes down. Okay. So there's this, that's a good stress. The cortisol and the adrenaline are actually helping get energy, and your muscles and heart work better and be able to perform better. So that's kind of the key difference. The bad stress is chronic, uncontrollable stress that leads to chronic neuroendocrine stress response, and good stress is transient, controlled stress.
And is there any way to measure it?
Well, yeah. One way would be to measure cortisol levels in the blood.
Okay.
This is something you perceive too, right?
Yes.
Without having to measure it. All runners, I'm sure there's many races where they get half of the way through the race, and they say, "Why am I doing this? I don't need to do
True.
this." And
Very true. I've been there.
And then 10 minutes after the race, you say, "Wow, that was great.
I'm going to do it again.
Can't wait to do it again." Right. So that's a good stress. Yeah. So that nowadays a lot of the bad stress is related to information overload and being constantly overworking, or being constantly bombarded with information without having a lot of time to slow down and think critically. Just take an hour thinking, whether you don't have anything coming in, but you've got a lot being generated internally. I think that's really important. And then sleep is really critical to helping protect against any potential long-term chronic stress, bad outcomes from bad stress.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've had a sleep expert on, but that's a very important thing.
Yes, we've had Dr. Amy Bender. She has spoken a couple of times about sleep in greater detail and has been very, very helpful. The point you talked about, the information overload, it's so cognitively taxing. Personally, I have experienced, and then I see that when I take flights, and if the flights are non-turbulent, that's one of my most productive times, because I can just think so much, particularly the long flights, no Wi-Fi, no internet, no network. You can just think. And my wife, she says, when you are in flight, I get a letter after that from you, or I get an expression from you, because that's possibly one of the times when I get to spend with me and think. So what you're saying, I relate so much with it.
For me now, since I retired, so I have a garden, right? Vegetable garden, and I spend Well, I spend quite a bit of time outside now in the garden or around the yard, and there's a lot of kind of routine things you can do that you don't have to think about, so that you can accomplish two things at the same time. You can do something that needs to be done. I actually like washing the dishes by hand, because you don't have to think. I think about other things while I'm washing the dishes, and it kind of puts you in a relaxed. There's something about thinking while you're moving, and I think this is an evolutionary thing. And runs, right? On a lot of my trail runs, during the run, I do a lot of good thinking, right? And I'm sure you have that too. So there's something about moving your body and thinking without interacting with any person, or being on a smartphone or things like that. There's something, I think the motion actually helps the thought process somehow.
Yeah, indeed it does. And the second question I had, which I promised that I'll ask two questions then. The second one is pain. Most people suffer from different types of pain almost all the time. I see you already are, and I know we in the start we talked about it. A lot of times there are just niggles, aches, and pains that are happening. Do you think some of it is related with the brain aging, chronic stress, or anything else? And can this also be managed through intermittent fasting from any of your previous research?
That's a good question. And there's strong associations between anxiety, depression, and pain. And chronic stress is often associated with anxiety and can lead to depression, clinical depression. And if you're having a lot of anxiety and you have some pain, the anxiety can exacerbate your perception of the pain. Wherever you're having pain on your body, there's kind of a quantitative disconnect between the actual amount of tissue damage or inflammation and your perception of that pain. So in my case, I have this gene mutation that does that. So I'm then if I have anxiety on top of that, then I've got a really big pain problem. So the answer is yes. And intermittent fasting, it hasn't. This is a good question, because this has not been looked at in any scientific way. How does intermittent fasting affect pain? So I can't say for sure. So I do both, right? Intermittent fasting and pain. So during this period when I couldn't exercise after I had the injury and surgeries, I was still intermittent fasting, but I wasn't exercising. And my pain level went up. I got depressed. So I was still intermittent fasting. And then when I got back exercising, so I think, and we've seen this, there's a protein that's increased in the brain with exercise. It's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And exercise has a huge increase in this BDNF, which has a antidepressive role in the brain. The intermittent fasting has maybe a small increase in BDNF, but it's not nearly as much as exercise. So this kind of very indirect evidence that, and I think it's probably right, exercise is much better for reducing anxiety, pain, perception of pain, and than is intermittent fasting.
Got it. Thank you. And quite a masterclass in talking about a number of things. I think we can keep going, but our podcast conversations are generally between 50 minutes and an hour. And today we are way over threshold, but it's such an interesting topic that I think our listeners are going to value immensely. And also I'm going to request that if we can have a possibly a longer conversation in future where I would like to request to cover a number of other points with regards to brain, particularly understanding more about the brain, its aging, and what are various other things that people can do to improve their brain health, because this is something that we as laymen, we are not privy to. When we think of our fitness or health, we just think of running or going to work out and just being in regular weight range and BMIs being okay. But talking about the brain health in detail in future will be of great value.
That's great, because I'd be happy to do that. I should say that on my podcast, Brain Ponderings, most of them are me having a guest on, but I've done essentially several lectures. I think I did 3 on where I had slides, right, illustrations of what I'm talking about. I had 3 on brain bioenergetics, where I cover some on exercise and intermittent fasting, and then I had 1 on brain aging. And those are easy to find. So I have a YouTube channel. I'm on Spotify and some other outlets. On the YouTube channel, if you just scroll through and find the ones that have like an image of a slide and not people.
But thank you very much for your time today, sir. This was very pleasurable and informative, and I'm sure our viewers and listeners will value a great deal of your time that you spent with us.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and it's just nice to meet you and see the good things you're doing. More people need to get good information out that people can use to improve their health and their brain function.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, with a promise to get you on the podcast again to discuss more about brain. Thank you so much for your time for today.
Yeah, goodbye.
Thank you, bye. That was all for today. I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed speaking with Dr. Mattson. If there is feedback that you would like for me to consider, if there is feedback that you have about this podcast, or any topics that you would like for us to cover, please let us know. You have us on social media channels. We've also provided various show notes from this conversation that will help you, particularly the podcast of Dr. Mattson about brain through his podcast channel, Brain Pondering, is fantastic. You should go through it, and we have outlined a couple of these links in the show notes. That is all for now, and we will speak with you next week again.